The moment someone asks themselves why they are hated without reason, a deeper emotional reality reveals itself. Most people, at some point, have felt the sting of being disliked not for something they did, but simply for who they are. This unsettling experience is what draws us into the complex terrain of the psychology of haters. Understanding it is not just about labeling others. It is about peeling back the emotional layers behind hate, exposing what it really means when someone despises another without cause. Hatred is not just a stronger version of dislike. It is far more persistent, personal, and psychologically destructive. While anger may be triggered by specific actions and eventually subside, hatred lingers in the mind. It evolves into an ongoing state of contempt, one that is often nurtured over time. From a psychological standpoint, hate forms when people experience internal discomfort, often insecurity, shame, or unresolved trauma, and cannot reconcile it internally. Instead of turning inward, they direct this discomfort outward. The result is not a reaction to you as a person, but to what you represent in their mind. This emotional redirection often begins with something known as social comparison, a psychological process in which people evaluate themselves by measuring their lives against others. When someone sees another person succeed, express confidence, or simply appear content, it can trigger a deep sense of inadequacy. The psychology of haters tells us that this comparison often leads to emotional projection. A person may not admit they are envious or insecure, but they will channel those feelings into criticism, mockery, or outright hostility. In these moments, hate becomes a psychological shield. Rather than confronting personal feelings of inferiority, the hater attempts to reclaim emotional power by diminishing someone else. This is not speculation. Neuropsychological studies have shown that areas of the brain associated with physical pain also activate when someone experiences social threat. Hate is often a response to this perceived social injury, even when the threat exists only in the mind of the hater. Haters frequently project their inner dissatisfaction onto others, a behavior rooted in Freud's theory of projection. If a person feels envious but cannot tolerate the discomfort of envy, they may instead decide that the other person is arrogant or undeserving. In this way, they rewrite their own emotional experience into a story where the target becomes the villain. The psychology of haters often centers around this act of rewriting reality, turning internal turmoil into external blame. But what makes someone susceptible to this pattern? Often, the answer lies in a fragile identity. People who lack a clear sense of self tend to define themselves in contrast to others. If someone does not know who they are, they may construct identity through rejection, by determining who or what they are not. In this construction, the person they choose to hate becomes a symbol of everything they cannot be or are afraid to try to become. The moment they encounter someone confident, successful, or authentic, they feel exposed. The presence of another person becomes a threat to their emotional survival. This identity threat is a major component in the psychology of haters. Evolutionary psychology also offers insight. In early tribal societies, fitting in was a matter of life or death. Anything different, anything unknown, was viewed as a potential danger to group cohesion. These instincts remain embedded in the human psyche. Today, we no longer live in isolated tribes, but we carry the same psychological programming. People still fear what feels unfamiliar or threatens their social structure. The individual who acts freely or achieves visibility may awaken deep-rooted tribal discomfort in others, leading to exclusion or hostility. This tribal psychology underpins much of the hate found in workplaces, classrooms, and online communities. When this ancient instinct meets the digital age, it becomes amplified. The psychology of haters becomes particularly visible on social media platforms, where groupthink, mob mentality, and the illusion of anonymity give people permission to express aggression with little consequence. What someone might never say face to face, they will type online with ease. Emotional projection is rewarded with attention. Social comparison becomes public. Hatred becomes part of the performance, a way to appear superior while masking insecurity. But not all hate is public or loud. Sometimes it comes quietly, from someone who avoids eye contact, speaks little, but carries silent resentment. And perhaps you've wondered, without ever asking aloud, why certain people seem to dislike you without reason. That feeling is not a misunderstanding. Hate does not always begin with evidence. It often begins with a story someone creates in their mind, a narrative in which your existence challenges their comfort. Ultimately, hate is rarely about you. It is about what you awaken in another person. The psychology of haters reveals that hatred is not personal, it is psychological. It stems from comparison, wounded ego, displaced emotion, and deep identity struggles. And once you begin to understand that, you stop taking it personally. You begin to see that hate is often a cry from someone lost in their own emotional confusion. You begin to detach. And in that detachment, you begin to reclaim power. To understand hatred, it is not enough to examine what people do. We must ask who they believe they are, and more importantly, who they fear they are not. The psychology of haters does not only live in behavior. It lives inside the fragile construction of self. Beneath most acts of hatred lies a deeper identity struggle, where the ego is both the mask and the battlefield. The ego, in psychological terms, is the identity we build to navigate the world. It helps us define what we believe, how we relate to others, and what we think we deserve. But not all egos are sturdy. Many are brittle, reactive, and deeply anxious. When the ego is wounded, especially by comparison, failure, or rejection, it looks for something or someone to blame. In this way, hate becomes a tool for emotional survival. It helps the person temporarily preserve the illusion that they are whole, even when they feel deeply fractured inside. The psychology of haters often centers around what psychologists call ego defense mechanisms. These are unconscious strategies the mind uses to protect itself from emotional pain. One such defense is denial, in which someone refuses to see the truth about their own emotions. Another is rationalization, where a person convinces themselves that someone else deserves to be hated. The most common and toxic, however, is projection. This is when someone attributes their own unacceptable feelings to another person. For example, someone who secretly envies you might accuse you of being arrogant or fake, because they cannot sit with their own discomfort. This is where the ego plays its most deceptive role. It tells the hater a story that shields them from inner conflict. That story might sound like, "They think they're better than me," or "They don't deserve what they have." But what the ego is really trying to avoid is the much harder truth. "I feel small when I see them." Hatred, then, becomes not a reaction to reality, but a refusal to face oneself. Much of this has been explored through the lens of Carl Jung's shadow theory, which suggests that every person carries a psychological shadow, a part of the self made up of traits we deny or repress. Qualities such as envy, cowardice, or weakness often get pushed into this shadow because they threaten our self-image. But what we bury does not disappear. It waits. And when we see those qualities reflected back at us through someone else's success, confidence, or authenticity, the shadow reacts. Instead of saying, "That could be me," it says, "That shouldn't be them." The hate that follows is not logical. It is emotional backlash from a part of the self that feels exposed. This phenomenon is especially common in people who are experiencing an identity crisis. When a person does not feel grounded in who they are, they become emotionally vulnerable to others who seem certain of themselves. Imagine someone who feels like a failure watching another person rise with ease. Instead of asking how they can grow, They may cling to the belief that the other person is cheating, shallow, or fake. The ego needs that belief to survive. Otherwise, the person is forced to confront their own paralysis, their unfulfilled dreams, or their abandoned goals. And perhaps you've felt this before without even realizing it. Maybe someone else's freedom made you feel trapped. Maybe someone's kindness made you feel unseen. These feelings are not rare. But the way we handle them defines whether we grow or whether we hate. The psychology of haters reveals that many people choose the latter path, not because they are evil, but because they are emotionally unprepared to do otherwise. The more fragile a person's sense of self-worth, the more likely they are to view others as threats instead of mirrors. This is especially true in environments that reward external validation, likes, approval, image, more than inner reflection. In such spaces, the ego becomes loud, defensive, and constantly scanning for anything that might challenge its authority. When that challenge appears in the form of a person who does not conform or who rises too quickly, the ego reacts with hostility. Philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote that those who despise themselves still respect themselves as ones who despise. It is a haunting observation. Hatred, in this view, becomes a desperate attempt to reclaim dignity, not by healing oneself, but by diminishing someone else. And so, when someone hates you without cause, it is often because your existence confronts a part of them they would rather keep buried. You may unknowingly activate their hidden fears, unresolved envy, or shame. You do not need to provoke them with words. Your presence is enough. Your confidence is enough. Your happiness is enough. The psychology of haters teaches us that hate is rarely personal in the way we assume it is. It is personal for the hater. It is about their relationship to their own ego, their wounds, and their unmet self. Understanding this can help you step back, not into cold indifference, but into quiet clarity. It allows you to see the mask, not just the behavior. And once you see it, you are no longer controlled by it. Hatred often wears different faces, but two of its most powerful emotional engines are envy and shame. These emotions, when left unexamined, feed the resentment that turns into targeted contempt. To understand the psychology of haters more deeply, one must trace the roots of what envy does to the human psyche, and how shame shapes the way people see themselves in relation to others. Envy is not always malicious. Psychologists have identified two forms of envy: benign envy and toxic envy. Benign envy is the kind that motivates self-improvement. It leads a person to admire someone else's success and feel inspired to grow. Toxic envy, however, distorts that admiration into hostility. It says, "If I can't have it, you shouldn't either." In toxic envy, the emotion turns outward in the form of blame, slander, or subtle sabotage. This is often the point at which hatred begins to emerge. The psychology of haters shows us that toxic envy arises most often when a person believes they are fundamentally incapable of attaining what another person has. It is not just about wanting something they do not possess. It is about feeling humiliated by the perceived gap between what they have and what you appear to embody. In this emotional equation, they begin to see your presence as an insult to their existence. This emotional pain is often intensified by shame, a deeply internalized belief that one is inadequate or unworthy. Unlike guilt, which is the feeling of having done something wrong, shame is the feeling of being something wrong. When someone feels shame, they do not just question their actions, they question their entire identity. In this context, encountering someone who appears self-assured, happy, or fulfilled can reopen old wounds of unworthiness. Shame is also contagious. Social psychology research suggests that individuals who carry unprocessed shame are more likely to project it onto others, particularly those they view as emotionally or socially secure. The psychology of haters involves this projection process in a way that is rarely conscious. A person who feels insignificant in their own life may direct their shame outward, cloaking it as critique, sarcasm, or passive-aggressive behavior. Think for a moment about a time when someone seemed irritated by your success without any obvious reason. Maybe you received praise or shared good news, and their reaction was cold, dismissive, or subtly undermining. That discomfort you sensed may not have been about what you said or did. It may have been a quiet surge of envy wrapped in shame, feelings they could not admit, even to themselves. In a world where social comparison is constant and often public, envy and shame are not rare emotional glitches. They are daily psychological experiences, especially online. Platforms that highlight success, beauty, and lifestyle become emotional battlegrounds where people compare their internal chaos to curated perfection. As that emotional gap widens, envy intensifies. And when envy meets shame, hatred becomes the result. What is perhaps most tragic about this process is how invisible it often is to the hater. People rarely admit to themselves that they feel threatened by someone else's joy. They do not consciously say, "Your freedom reminds me of my fear." Instead, they rewrite the story to protect their self-image. They tell themselves, "You're showing off," or "You don't deserve it," or "It must be fake." These conclusions are not based on reality. They are based on emotional defense. Envy and shame also work together to distort self-perception. A person who envies you might convince themselves that you did something wrong just by succeeding. This emotional logic is flawed, but emotionally compelling. It provides the hater with justification for their hostility. That is why the psychology of haters cannot be separated from emotional repression. What is not acknowledged inwardly eventually lashes out externally. This raises a difficult but important question. How often do people hate because they are afraid to feel vulnerable? Vulnerability is the emotional state required for healing envy and shame, but it is also the state most people avoid. To sit with envy means to admit to wanting. To sit with shame means to acknowledge pain. But hating someone else feels safer, at least in the moment. It offers the illusion of power while quietly eroding self-worth from within. What we learn from the psychology of haters is that hate does not begin as hatred. It begins as a wound, a fear, a longing. It begins in the spaces where a person has not yet forgiven themselves for being who they are. And when that inner forgiveness is missing, the world becomes a mirror that feels too harsh to face. So they look for someone else to shatter it. Knowing this does not make hatred easier to experience, but it does make it easier to interpret. When someone's hostility seems irrational or cruel, it is often because it is not about you at all. It is about them trying to outrun their own reflection. It is about someone being unable to love what they see in the mirror, and blaming you for the clarity of the glass. The internet was supposed to connect us, and in many ways it has. But it has also magnified the loudest, darkest emotions inside us. Among those emotions, hate has found a home. The psychology of haters has evolved rapidly in the digital era, not because people have changed, but because the environment now rewards emotional extremes. The screen does not just reflect identity, it distorts it. And in that distortion, hate begins to multiply. Online hate is different from the resentment one encounters face to face. It is often more impulsive, more aggressive, and strangely more normalized. People who would never express disdain in person may pour it out in the comments section of a stranger's video. This transformation is not random. It has been studied under the concept of online disinhibition, a phenomenon where individuals feel less accountable for their behavior when hidden behind a screen. In this virtual space, the usual psychological brakes, shame, empathy, responsibility, begin to loosen. The digital environment lowers the cost of cruelty. When there are no visible consequences, people feel free to say what they would otherwise suppress. This effect is especially dangerous when combined with anonymity. The internet gives people masks, and those masks allow them to become versions of themselves that they might even fear in real life. Hatred becomes easier to type than to say, and once it is typed, it echoes in the form of likes, shares, and affirmation. What makes the psychology of haters in digital spaces even more complex is the role of algorithmic outrage. Social media platforms are designed to prioritize engagement. Emotional content, especially content charged with anger, sarcasm, or moral judgment, performs better than calm reasoning. The result is a digital economy where hate becomes profitable. The more emotionally explosive a comment is, the more likely it is to be seen, and visibility becomes its own reward. Imagine someone scrolling through a highlight reel of other people's lives. They feel envy, then inadequacy, then irritation. And just a few swipes away, they see others expressing similar irritation. The emotion no longer feels personal. It feels communal. In this moment, digital mob mentality is born. People begin to attack not out of reason, but out of emotional resonance. The target may be someone they have never met, someone they know nothing about. But they see confidence, success, or authenticity, and they respond with contempt. Online hate is not only about disagreement. Often, it is not even about the person being targeted. It is about projection, emotional discharge, and the temporary relief that comes from putting someone else down. The psychology of haters reveals that cyber resentment often operates as emotional misdirection. Instead of facing internal discomfort, the hater pours it outward into a digital space that invites it and rewards it. This behavior becomes especially visible during moments of comment section toxicity, where thousands of strangers gather to express contempt toward a person who may have done nothing objectively wrong. The person might be sharing a vulnerable truth, celebrating a milestone, or simply existing in their truth. But the more visible they are, the more they become a target. Online visibility comes with emotional risk. Because behind every viral moment is a wave of anonymous hostility waiting to surface. What is often overlooked is how virtual judgment distorts self-perception. For those receiving online hate, it becomes difficult to distinguish between sincere feedback and displaced anger. 1,000 criticisms, even from faceless profiles, can trigger deep emotional responses: shame, anxiety, self-doubt. The digital mirror does not just reflect what others think. It forces individuals to question who they are. And for the haters themselves, the virtual world becomes a place to vent unresolved identity issues. The person who mocks a stranger's joy might be carrying years of suppressed disappointment. The one who insults confidence might be trapped in self-doubt. Behind the cruelty is often emotional exhaustion. But instead of expressing pain directly, it comes out sideways, through sarcasm, trolling, or mockery. It is worth asking, how much of what we call online hate is really just a collective cry for emotional validation? The screen offers distance, but it also offers disguise. A person can appear powerful while feeling powerless. They can type cruelty with trembling fingers. And the false sense of superiority they gain lasts only a moment, until the emotion returns unhealed. Understanding the psychology of haters in the digital age requires us to see the internet not as a separate world, but as a magnifier of the emotional world we carry within. Hate travels faster here, but it is still born from the same places: envy, shame, fear, and comparison. The only difference now is that it is louder, more contagious, and always watching. In a world where visibility is power, and attention is currency, hatred has found its most fertile ground. But even here, the truth remains: What someone says online tells you more about their wounds than about your worth. There is something uniquely painful about being disliked by someone who does not know you. Even when we tell ourselves not to care, the feeling lingers. Words from strangers often strike deeper than we expect. That sensation of being judged, misunderstood, or hated without reason is not just a social irritation. It is a psychological wound. And to understand it, we must look closely at why hate feels so personal, and why it often affects us more than it should. The psychology of haters reveals that their judgments are rarely about the target. But for the person on the receiving end, the experience is deeply intimate. This is because human beings are wired for social belonging. From infancy, our survival depended on acceptance. Rejection did not just threaten our emotional stability, it threatened our place in the tribe. That ancient wiring still lives within us. And even today, in a world filled with digital interaction, the pain of being excluded or insulted still activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. This phenomenon is known as social pain theory. Neuroscientific studies have shown that the brain regions triggered by social rejection, especially the anterior cingulate cortex, are the same regions involved in processing physical pain. When someone hates us or shames us, our brain does not make a rational distinction between emotional and physical threat. It simply registers danger. That is why hateful words, even from strangers, can feel like emotional bruises. But there is more happening beneath the surface. One of the reasons we take hate personally is because of something psychologists call rejection sensitivity. People who have experienced past trauma, abandonment, or chronic invalidation often become hyper-aware of emotional threats. When they perceive negativity, no matter how minor, it triggers a cascade of fear and self-doubt. This heightened emotional response leads to a negative feedback loop. You get hurt, withdraw, and become even more sensitive to future judgment. Over time, even harmless comments begin to feel like attacks. Yet even those without trauma are affected. The reason lies in our mirror neurons, a network in the brain responsible for empathy and emotional resonance. Mirror neurons help us understand the intentions and emotions of others. But they also make us emotionally absorbent. When someone expresses hate toward us, we do not simply observe it, we feel it. The emotion enters our system, mimicking a direct psychological injury. And the more visible we are, the more exposed we feel. There is a quiet tragedy in how much power we give to those who do not know us. A single hateful comment can silence days of self-trust. A single glance of disapproval can erase months of self-work. But that power is not real. It is emotional projection, ours, not theirs. The stranger's words only hurt because they tap into something unhealed within us. The psychology of haters reminds us that people project their own emotional struggles. But we forget that we often receive that projection through the filter of our own emotional wounds. So the deeper question is not, why do they hate me? But, why do I believe them? What makes their judgment more valid than my truth? What part of me still waits for permission to exist without apology? Understanding this leads us to an uncomfortable realization. When we take hate personally, we may be unconsciously seeking emotional validation from people who were never meant to give it. Their hostility becomes a mirror reflecting our insecurities. And instead of turning away, we stare. We internalize. We allow the momentary judgment of someone else to rewrite the story we tell ourselves. But this habit can be unlearned. It begins by separating judgment from truth. Not every comment needs to be absorbed. Not every insult deserves interpretation. And not every hater has the right to influence your self-perception. When someone hates you without cause, they are not speaking to your worth. They are revealing their own unresolved pain. Their dislike may be loud, but that volume comes from internal pressure, not from clarity. Their words are symptoms, not insight. Their rejection is not a map of who you are, but a snapshot of who they are in that moment. It helps to ask, if this hate was never about me, then what part of me is still holding on to it? Letting go does not mean pretending it did not hurt. It means reclaiming authorship over how you interpret it. The psychology of haters shows us how projection, insecurity, and shame get tangled into hostility. But our responsibility is not to fix the hater. It is to heal the part of ourselves that still believes them. Because the moment you stop letting others define your worth is the moment hate begins to lose its shape. And in that moment you begin to see yourself, not through the eyes of judgment, but through the lens of truth. Hate rarely feels like a gift. It wounds, confuses, and sometimes lingers longer than we expect. Yet beneath the sting of rejection, there is a quieter opportunity, an opening to grow in ways we rarely notice when life is smooth. The psychology of haters teaches more than the mechanics of envy and shame. It offers an unexpected path to personal transformation, if we are willing to look past the surface of hostility. When someone expresses hatred toward you without cause, your instinct might be to defend, retreat, or even retaliate. But what if the presence of hate could be seen differently, not as a personal attack, but as a mirror, showing what still needs to be healed or understood inside yourself? Emotional growth often begins in the places where we feel most uncomfortable. And hatred, paradoxically, can become one of those uncomfortable teachers. This begins with the concept of self-awareness, a psychological state in which you become an observer of your own thoughts, triggers, and patterns. When you encounter hate, you can ask yourself not just what the other person is projecting, but what their reaction awakens in you. Does their hostility trigger fear? Does it echo a past wound? Does it cause you to question your worth? These questions are not about self-blame. They are about identity healing, uncovering the emotional vulnerabilities that still shape how you interpret the world. In this space of reflection, compassionate detachment becomes powerful. This does not mean ignoring pain or pretending hatred does not exist. It means stepping back emotionally, just enough to see the hater as someone lost in their own inner conflict. This perspective does not excuse their behavior. It allows you to reclaim the mental energy that would otherwise be spent trying to win their approval or understand their resentment. The psychology of haters repeatedly reminds us that those who hate the loudest are often those who suffer the most silently. A person who attacks your joy, your success, or your truth is often fighting a battle you cannot see. And while you are not responsible for their healing, you are responsible for how much of their pain you allow into your story. One of the most profound insights in psychology comes from Viktor Frankl, who believed that suffering becomes bearable when we can give it meaning. When you are the target of toxic criticism, that experience can either weaken your sense of self or strengthen it, depending on how you frame it. If you choose to see the hate as a test of resilience, a prompt to clarify who you are, or a reason to grow emotionally stronger, it stops being something that happened to you, and starts becoming something that shaped you. This is the essence of personal transformation. You begin to view emotional adversity not as a wall, but as a threshold. You cross that threshold by asking, "What part of me is ready to grow through this?" That question alone shifts you from reaction to mastery. It moves you from being shaped by hate to becoming immune to it. What is also important is developing self-compassion, the ability to soothe yourself instead of seek validation from those who cannot offer it. Self-compassion means that you acknowledge the pain of rejection without letting it define your identity. It means giving yourself the same understanding and comfort you might offer a friend who was unfairly criticized. In doing so, you break the cycle of seeking external approval to feel whole. You may never change the hater. And truthfully, that is not your role. But you can change your relationship to their presence in your life. You can allow their noise to fade beneath the sound of your own clarity. And you can let their darkness contrast the light of your growth, not obscure it. Sometimes the most powerful form of emotional freedom is not winning the battle of opinions. It is realizing that you do not need to fight it at all. The psychology of haters offers one final insight, that hatred, at its root, is always about the person who carries it. But what you choose to do with that knowledge determines the direction of your growth. You can allow it to shrink you, or you can allow it to sculpt you. So the next time someone's hate finds its way toward you, just pause, not to absorb it, but to witness it. Behind every cruel word is a story that was never healed. And behind every person who continues forward, despite that hate, is a deeper form of courage. Hatred is one of the most corrosive emotions in human relationships. It alienates, distorts, and divides. Yet when we trace its origins through the lens of psychology, we find not cruelty, but confusion. We find pain. And we find people trying, often unconsciously, to escape from themselves. Throughout this journey, we have explored the many faces of hate. From envy and projection to shame and ego defense, from tribal instincts to the anonymity of online spaces, we have uncovered how the psychology of haters is rarely about the people they attack. It is about the emotional burdens they have not yet learned to carry. It is about wounds still open, identities still unsettled, and lives shaped more by fear than by truth. But perhaps the most important discovery lies not in understanding the hater, but in understanding your own reaction to hate. What you absorb, what you question, what you internalize, all of it reveals the parts of yourself still seeking resolution. And this realization is not weakness. It is emotional intelligence. It is self-awareness in motion. You cannot stop hatred from existing in the world. But you can decide whether it defines you. You can choose to respond with dignity instead of defense, with clarity instead of confusion. And you can learn to see hate not as a judgment of your value, but as a reflection of someone else's unresolved story. This is what personal power looks like. It is not loud. It does not retaliate. It simply continues forward, grounded in truth, immune to noise. If hatred tries to rewrite your story, write it back with your presence. If someone's judgment speaks louder than your self-worth, let your actions become the answer. If you feel wounded, know that healing is not the absence of pain, but it is the decision to grow through it. The psychology of haters may begin with others, but the freedom it points to belongs to you.